Week. Weeks like these, I find that I don't always have a good judgment of what I can and cannot do. So I'd worked on my sermon before this week, hoping to have it done. Didn't quite have it done. So with recovering from surgery, all the fun little pain medication, the naps and stuff, I think I have a whole sermon. And I got to the end, I was reading through it, I'm like, I hope this makes sense. I think it makes sense to me, but I don't know. Maybe I was dreaming it made sense. I don't know. So I'm hoping this follows a point today. But I did want to thank everybody. A couple of you brought dinners one night for us, and Amy's learned to cook again, and I found that a great way to lose weight is to have to eat left-handed, because it takes longer to get the food to your mouth and not all of it gets there. And so my clothing has been changed often this week, but I've lost a few pounds. So, it's been interesting. Hey, we're continuing in our series on Luke. Today, our survey through it. And today we're in Luke 14. And in this passage today, Jesus is going to talk about the cost of discipleship. There's a guy named Ferdinand de Lesseps, and he had a dream. His dream was to build a passage from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. He wanted to build the Panama Canal. He had two spots, one in Panama, one in Nicaragua. We could have known it all these years as the Nicaragua Canal, but things didn't work out. It went through Panama. He hosted an international congress of the Interoceanic Canal. It's a very fancy word. And they began to plan for the project. There were 74 delegates. Most of them were French. And they voted on how to proceed and what type of canal to build. Only 19 of those 74 were engineers, which might explain some things later on. But only one of them had ever set foot in Panama. So they began to plan to build a canal in a place they'd never been. After 1 decade, it was a miserable failure. They had spent, this is back in late 1800s, they had spent $287 million. Around 20,000 people had died of disease or accident, most of those of disease. De Lesseps was convicted of fraud because he raised all this money and the project was such a bust that he hadn't delivered it and the finances were an absolute mess. So they sold it to the United States. If you remember, Teddy Roosevelt wanted that project. America spent $352 million on it, which brings the total to $639 million. After America took over, 5,609 people died, most of them by accident. They'd figured out the malaria thing. The total deaths between the French and the Americans was roughly 25,000 or 500 persons per mile of the canal. It was finished 33 years after the digging actually began. The end result was good, but it took a long time to get there. George Armstrong Custer, many of you have heard of him. He had a regiment of 655 men. He chose to attack an Indian village on the Little Bighorn River on June 25th, 1876. He was confident of the element of surprise, and there certainly was an element of surprise involved. He divided his force into 3 parts. He sent 2 of the parties around in a flanking movement, and he and his 264 men charged right up the middle, into the middle of about anywhere from 2,500 to 4,500 warriors. Their only surprise was that Custer actually considered attacking them. They wiped him out. The only survivor of Custer's squad was one horse named Comanche. History is full of stories of people who did not count the cost before they began their quest or their project. And in Luke today, we're going to see that Jesus was followed by large crowds of people, many of whom were not taking seriously the cost of following Christ. Jesus' public ministry attracted such a large following. Sometimes it was hard for him to get time to get a breath away from the crowds. But among the crowds were people who were attracted by many different interests. Physically, these people are on their way to Jerusalem with Jesus. They're in his entourage, but there's a suggestion here that they're just going along with him spiritually as well. They held certain beliefs about him, but it's not clear that they truly believe in him. And Jesus knew that most of this crowd was probably not in the least bit interested in spiritual things. They were like a lot of people today. They're willing to follow Jesus as long as the cost is not too high or the demands are too great. They were just like some people today who look to Jesus to solve their money problems or their family problems or their health problems, but who quickly grow disillusioned and unwilling to follow Jesus if it doesn't solve those problems or if following requires sacrifices on their part. It would seem that Jesus was never really impressed by the size of the crowd, just by sheer numbers. For Jesus now turns to this crowd of people with mixed spiritual commitment, and he speaks of the demands for discipleship. Words that seem deliberately aimed at thinning their ranks. Those demands are stated in a phrase that occurs 3 times in verse 26, 27, and 33. And in this text, he says, he cannot be my disciple. He cannot be my disciple. He or they cannot be my disciple. Let's read the passage beginning at verse 25. A large crowd was following Jesus. He turned around and he said to them, if you want to be my disciple, you must hate everyone else by comparison. Your father, your mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even your own life. Otherwise, you cannot be my disciple. And if you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. But don't begin until you count the cost. For who would begin construction of a building without first calculating the cost to see if there's enough money to finish it? Otherwise, you might complete only the foundation before running out of money, and then everyone would laugh at you. They would say, there's the person who started that building and couldn't afford to finish it. Or what king would go to war against another king without first sitting down with his counselors to discuss whether his army of 10,000 could defeat the 20,000 soldiers marching against him? And if he can't, he'll send a delegation to discuss terms of peace while the enemy is still far away. So you cannot become my disciple without giving up everything you own. Salt is good for seasoning, but if it loses its flavor, how do you make it salty again? Flavorless salt is good neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It's thrown away. Anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand. So we see that Jesus was growing in popularity. A lot of people were following Jesus for a lot of reasons. Some followed him because he kept their stomachs full. Remember the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000? If you hung out with Jesus, you got fed, it looked like. Come to church, you get a potluck, right? Some came just because of the miracles. It was dazzling. It was exciting. It was entertaining. You never knew what was going to happen if you just go to the crowd and see what Jesus was going to do today. And some came just because they followed the crowd. Well, there's a bunch of people gathered and we should go see what it's all about. I think the same thing is true today. People go to church for a lot of different reasons. Some come for the stuff. If I come, they'll give me stuff. I get those calls as a pastor. If you'll help me, I promise I'll come to your church. That's not one I've ever seen come true, to be honest. We help people, but I have no expectation that they'll actually come to the church if I get a random call. They just know churches are supposed to be good, and we are. We're supposed to be helpful. I don't begrudge helping. It's God's money. God can handle whether we've been bamboozled or whether it's legit. But people come to church sometimes because they want the stuff. Christians are generous. If I go there, I'll get stuff. Sometimes we dress it up different ways. We can put it out on that sort of folks. But sometimes we dress it up and we take the approach, we're going to go to their church because they got more activities for our kids. They got more social activities for adults. It's fun over there. They have parties all the time. There's always something going on. Some people choose a church because it's more dazzling. more exciting, more entertaining than others. Their band is awesome, right? They rock. One of our members here tells of a church they go to where they hand out earplugs before you go in because they know it's going to be too loud for some people. Really? I don't usually pick on churches or things, but I'm like, if you know ahead of time you're going to blow somebody's eardrums away, wouldn't you want to turn down the volume? I thought worship was about God. I've seen worship with flashing lights, with dry ice smoke across the stage, all that stuff. I saw that when I went to see Journey in an arena, but I don't know if we need all that stuff. It seems a little different than what I read in the New Testament about what worship is. But if it's exciting, we'll do it. I'm going there. That pastor is hilarious over there, by the way. Boy, he's like watching a stand-up comedian. It's awesome. I know that y'all never say that, so. Some people choose a church because it's the biggest one in town. That's where everyone goes. You can make some good business connections if you go to that church. That's where the real estate agents go. And that's what Jesus was dealing with. But Jesus wasn't looking for crowds. He was looking for disciples. And so Jesus turns and he speaks to the crowd in a deliberate effort to check that wild, unthinking enthusiasm of the crowds that were following him just to be following. These words in Luke 14:25 and following are some of the most piercing, exacting words of Christ regarding discipleship that you will find in the Gospels. What distinguishes a true disciple from just a tag-along? Full consecration. Being fully dedicated to God. That separates the casual from the committed. This is the only place I know of where Jesus states discipleship in terms of who cannot be his disciple. Other places, it's who can be my disciple. So there's three kinds of people who cannot be his disciple, he says. First is those who put personal relationships ahead of Christ. He says here, if you don't hate your family. Does he really mean hate? That sounds kind of like a cult, doesn't it? He's not saying that we need to be malicious, hateful, and ugly towards our family. He's talking about the very real possibility that there may be a competition of loyalty in our lives to other people. Well, I can't do this, God, because I've got kids. I can't do this, Lord, because my parents would think this. I can't do this because my wife would think this. I can't do this with whatever reason that we have, whatever relationship takes precedent over Jesus. Now, if Jesus were really saying hate, then he would be contradicting a Bible that respects authority and honors and loves parents. So we know he does not mean the opposite of what God has already said, to honor your parents, to love your family. He wouldn't contradict the word of the Father himself or the apostles that follow. Family, especially non-Christian family, can have a difficult time with God's call on your life. My wife can share with you her testimony of becoming a Christian when she was in college. It did not sit well with her family. They were not walking with God at the time. She was called the Bible thumper and a bunch of other different names. The great thing is that every one of her family is a Christian today and have a very different perspective of that. But at the time, they didn't like it. Sometimes Christian families have a hard time with your call. You're called to missions? Oh, surely God isn't calling you to go overseas and take my grandbabies that far away. And we can put pressure on our own families to disobey God's call in their life. One of the greatest gifts my parents ever gave me was they said they would rather have me in the center of God's will than living next door to them or living down the street from them. What a gift. What freedom. There might be friends that you have that try and pull you away from following Christ. They tease you about your commitment, or they criticize your beliefs, or maybe they're more passive about it and they just want to pull you along with them into things that you know aren't right. Teenagers, dating is a big deal. If you realize that a particular relationship detracts from your walk, you need to break up that relationship. Look for somebody who enhances, not cripples your walk with God. Look for friends who encourage you to grow in your walk with God, not who pull you away from God. People who put personal relationships above Christ cannot be his disciple. People that put personal desires and goals above Christ cannot be his disciple. Under the Roman rule, the Jews had learned what it meant to bear a cross. And so Jesus uses this illustration because it was well understood. They had seen many a person drag their cross out to the hill to be crucified on. Now, it may not be necessarily literal, though it can be. We're fortunate here that it hasn't become literal, but there are countries in the world where if you want to follow Christ, it will cost you your life. The cross is an emblem of death. The cross to be carried by the Christian can only be understood with relationship to the experience of Christ. To follow him requires unswerving commitment to the will of God for your whole life in the face of the greatest threats and dangers, even if it costs you your physical life. If we're going to be fully consecrated, fully committed disciples, then we're going to say no to ourselves and we're going to ask God for our direction. We're going to put aside our own goals and selfish desires rather than focusing on our will. Romans 12:1 says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship." That's surrender. That's giving up. That's not debate. Well, Lord, let me think about this commitment. It's, Lord, I've already given you myself. And so if that's what you require of me, that's what I give. And the problem is an old problem. Isaiah 53:6 said, all of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. That is our natural bent. Our humanity wants to go do our own thing. But a consecrated disciple says, God, I want to do your thing. Do we submit our preferences to God's preferences? Do we take time to consider God when opportunities arise? Third, those who put personal possessions ahead of Christ cannot be his disciples. Now, does Jesus literally mean we have to get rid of everything and take a vow of poverty in order to become a Christian? What does he mean? When money or the things that money can buy make us hesitant about following what we feel the Lord is calling us to do, then we have become disciples of those things, not disciples of Jesus. One test of discipleship is what are we doing with our resources? Regardless of your income, if we're not giving regularly, if we're not giving generously, we're not living like the disciples of Jesus. From the Gospels to Revelation, we see that the impact that Jesus has on a life is he turns them into a generous giver, a joyful giver. Now, this is not a plea for money. Our bills are being paid. We're not one of those churches. We won't check your income at the door. We won't send you a bill. But one of the things that happens is when God begins to work in your life, you become generous because you're giving away his stuff. Right? You've already given everything to him. It's not your stuff. It's not your income. It's not your house. It's not your cars. It's his stuff. And when we're totally sold out, we just do with God's stuff what God tells us to do with his stuff. That possessive attitude of things can be one of the most destructive, evil forces in our own life. Corrie ten Boom said that she tried not to hold on to everything, or that she tried to hold on to everything she had loosely, or else it would hurt too much when God tried to pry it out of her grasp. She wanted to just be willing to give it. A.W. Tozer writes, and he says, that ancient curse of selfishness will not go out painlessly. It must be torn out like a plant from the soil. It must be pulled out like a tooth from the jaw. It must be chased out like the money changers in the temple. I understand that statement better than I once did. I had to have 2 wisdom teeth pulled. And the doctor said, well, we can put you to sleep, do all that stuff, or I'm pretty good, we can just pull them out. Well, it saved money to pull them out. And I'm like, yeah, let's go for it. That was a bad idea. They had been in there long enough, they had fused to the jawbone. So I got to be, all those horrible noises that we talk about from the dentist that you don't want to hear? I heard them all. His foot's on my chest, the wrench is in my mouth, he's yanking and pulling. There's a saw going on. I'm like, is that smoke? Oh, that's my jaw. Oh, wow. They finally got him out, so I have like a J-shaped bite. If I ever bite you, you'll know it's me because it's shaped like a J. It's not like a U. It's uneven. That was a hard tooth to come out. And then I'm like, oh, they got it. You're like, okay, now for the bottom one. Whole process all over again. It's hard to get that selfishness out of us, isn't it? We like our stuff. And we forget it's not our stuff. So Jesus goes on. He talks about who can't be his disciples, but then he goes ahead and he says, listen, it's a big deal to follow me. I'm asking for everything, so you better think about it. Don't just jump in. I want you to count the cost to become a disciple. Look at verse 28. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Will he not first sit down and estimate the cost to see if he has enough money to complete it? For if he lays the foundations not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule him, saying, this fellow began to build and was not able to finish. To many of those who heard Jesus, his words, his requirements for discipleship seemed a little strict and a little demanding. Their natural response would have been to wonder why. Why does discipleship have to be so tough? So Jesus uses these 2 stories, the first of the builder there. He talks about a careless builder. Almost all of us have seen some building project that has begun but never finished. The wise builder, the Lord suggests, will estimate the cost to see if he has enough money to finish the project. He'll make a careful evaluation of the cost, the risk, the resources. Otherwise, that unfinished structure will be visible evidence. In fact, a monument to his impulsive commitment, and his failure will expose him to ridicule. Discipleship is not a casual or an occasional activity. It's an exciting adventure, but it's also a draining and demanding lifestyle. Warfare may look thrilling in the movies, but it looks very different from the trenches. I had a chance to go to the World War I Museum in Kansas City a couple weeks ago. It was fascinating, and I've read about trenches and all that stuff, but when you got to stand there and see those life-size trenches that they had and see that, ew. And knowing that those guys had to jump out of those refuse-filled trenches into the face of machine guns, ew. There was nothing glorious or glamorous about it. And I think one of the things that we struggle with maybe in the American church is we have fallen in love with the crowd. And so often, that's how we evaluate our church. And growth is good, don't get me wrong. Growth is good. We need to be reaching people for Christ. It's good to grow, but what does that mean? If I have a crowd that's full of people who are only there to be entertained, if I have a crowd full of people that are there that just because they want something or just because other people are here and it's the place to be, what have I got? And I think in order to get the crowd, sometimes we sacrifice telling people about the demands of discipleship. We want to make it easy for them. well, we're not going to tell you the whole cost of following Jesus, but we're like the insurance salesman or the card guy, right? We'll just give you a little bit of it. And then later you read the fine print and you go, wait a second, this is not what I signed up for. We'll just tell you a little bit of it. When you come to Jesus, you get forgiveness of your sins, which is awesome, right? We would all agree with that. And when you come to Jesus, you get a lot of friends because, you got all the other church people here and we do stuff. That's great. And it's true. But where do they go when you come to Jesus? You got to give up all your rights. And there's going to be some things that are going to happen in your life because Satan's not going to really like it. And there's going to be evil influences that come in and try to derail you. And you're going to get discouraged. And it's okay because Jesus is still there with you, but it's going to be hard. And there's going to be days you're going to go, oh, did I do the right thing? Am I nuts? Why are people picking on me just because I'm a Christian? And you'll be discouraged. And we won't tell them that part. And we don't tell them, you know what? I know you kind of like your life the way it is, and so for whatever reason you're following Jesus, it's going to change. Because there's areas in your life that don't match up to God's will and His Word, and so the Holy Spirit's going to begin to change you, and your life's going to be different because you're following Jesus. Wait. When I was a college minister, I shared the gospel with a young lady she'd been coming to the church, been coming to our student group. We met at the union. I shared the gospel with her, and I said, is that something you want to do? And she goes, no. She understood it. And I said, well, why not? And she goes, well, I'm afraid that God will change my life. So she understood it. I like my life the way it is, and I don't want it to change. It was really tough for me. That's the first time I'd ever had anybody understand the gospel and walk away from it. I'd had people that weren't ready yet walk away from it, but I'd never had somebody that fully understood what it was about and go, no, not for me. The call to follow Christ is the call to give up our life. He gave up His life for us, and so now we give up our life for Him. He goes on here, and he says, not only do you need to count the cost of becoming a disciple, you need to count the cost of not becoming a disciple. So for everybody that leaps up out of the trench without looking, there are a dozen more who never leap at all. Most people don't have as much difficulty with impulsiveness in the spiritual realm as they do inactivity. The first step is the hardest. The step of making a decision is the hardest. Our hearts might be warm, but our feet grow cold. And Jesus knew that impulsiveness was a problem for just a few, but others are hindered by their unwillingness to make a commitment. And so to them, Jesus tells the next story, beginning in verse 31. Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Will he not first down and consider whether he's able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he's not able, he'll send a delegation while the other is still a long way off, and he'll ask for terms of peace. In the same way, any of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple. And it's foolish to begin without counting the cost, but it's disastrous to delay your choice without considering the consequences. Not only do we need to count the cost of becoming a disciple, we need to count the cost of not becoming a disciple. To decide not to decide is not an option. Every follower of Jesus is invited to weigh the risks, to make his choice, and to live with the consequences. We can choose to put it off. Well, I'll always have time. But we know this year, because we see it on the news every day, of people who thought they had time and who didn't have time. Well, even if I die of COVID, I got some time. Some people don't. You're in a coma for that last bit. You're unconscious. I've never been one for scare tactics, but when God's working on your heart and God's calling you, don't put it off. Decide. So in order to show the cost of not following, Jesus says in verse 34 and 35, salt is good for seasoning, But if it loses its flavor, how do you make it salty again? Flavorless salt is good neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It's thrown away. Anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand. I think Jesus is saying that people who follow him without total commitment are like salt that has lost its saltiness. They might have the appearance of being his disciples, but they can't be used in the kingdom like they should. Without commitment, the Christian is tasteless salt, useless to achieve God's purpose. Jesus is talking about those who only give part of their lives to him. They'll commit to following Jesus one day a week. Sunday's not so hard. I got time off from work. It's not really costing me anything. On Sundays, I'll be a Christian. But not the other 6. And they'll commit to following Jesus in their marriage, maybe, but not in their finances. And that kind of half-hearted commitment won't work in the same way that salt that has lost its taste is of no use. We're good at compartmentalizing. It's one of the problems I have when we say, well, Jesus should be your top priority. I disagree. He should be the Lord of your priorities. Because what happens is we compartmentalize and we get Jesus over here, we got God over here. I read my Bible this morning, check, I'm done with that priority. Now I can get about the other priorities during the day, and Jesus doesn't have anything to do with them because we got them compartmentalized. Now I got work, that's its own thing. I got my family, that's its own thing. I got my hobby, that's its own thing. When we come to follow Jesus, he says, I want to be Lord of all. I'm not sharing with the other things in your life. I'm Lord of everything in your life. And so he's the Lord of my hobbies. He's the Lord of my family. He's the Lord of my work. And Jesus' words are tough. And they're sobering. They don't leave any room for mediocrity in Christianity. And it forces us to ask some tough questions. Is there any relationship that comes ahead of Christ in your life? If he's first, then you're obviously not going to allow any other relationship to draw you away from obedience to him. Is he the Lord of your plans, your thoughts, all that you do? Are you clinging to your plans, living life your way instead of trying to please him with your every thought, word, and deed? Is he the Lord of your finances and your possessions? Are you faithful in managing those things for his purpose? Do you give generously and liberally to his work? The call to follow Jesus is the call to give up all of who we are and all of who we have to follow him. I tell you, though, we do not lose out. Because now all that we have is Jesus. And he is more than enough. He satisfies our needs in relationships. He satisfies our spiritual need. He takes care of our financial needs. He's got it all. And so really we lose nothing. And we get the freedom of being a steward of his stuff, no longer is it my life, no longer is it my stuff. I just get to be a steward of his stuff. Can I tell you that takes some pressure off? Because it's not my responsibility anymore, it's his responsibility. And I just get the joy of doing what he's asked me to do. And if we do that, our lives will make an impact on those around us. Because they'll see what true Christianity is. They won't see what TV tells them Christianity is. They won't tell what sitcoms make fun of. It won't tell them what the news doesn't like. They won't have the example of the nut job that it seems like they go find every time they need an example of a Christian and put on the news. Because they know people who are truly sold out to Jesus Christ. And they know that's what a Christian is. Let's pray.